Madam Deputy President, I rise to speak to this motion in my name. Elections are a fundamental right of the citizens of Tasmania. Unfortunately, though, we are seeing a pattern develop in this state of Tasmanian voters losing confidence in the health and integrity of our elections, and it's time to put an end to that pattern before it becomes entrenched and the integrity of our democracy becomes eroded. It's vital that public confidence in the conduct of elections is actively maintained. Citizens deserve to have full confidence in the administration of elections and have an avenue to raise and have examined any questions or concerns. This is in the public interest, and such an inquiry proposed in this motion is within the purview of both houses of our Parliament, and Parliament can and must play a key role in maintaining that public confidence. At the outset, let me state, Madam Deputy President, that this move to establish a joint House committee inquiry is focused upon the conduct of the election and matters arising, and is in no way intended to dispute the vote count or result. I have already placed upon the public record that I accept the general election outcome for the House of Assembly and the outcome for the contest of the Legislative Council seats of Derwent and Windermere. And to be perfectly frank, Madam Deputy President, it would be disingenuous for the government to claim surprise at the fact that there are now calls for a forum in which to raise and hopefully resolve the myriad of contentious issues swirling around and throughout the circumstances of the 2021 State and Legislative Council elections. To commence this debate, I thought it would be fitting first to go back to the beginning for all of us, Madam Deputy President, all of us as members of Parliament, especially as the opening of this 50th Tasmanian Parliament has seen new members, both in this and the other place, take their respective oaths of allegiance or affirmations. And even for those of us previously sworn in, bearing witness to those solemn pledges is always a significant reminder and opportunity to refocus on the privilege and responsibility each and every one of us holds on behalf of those who placed us here. Further, it's pertinent to this debate to consider the Code of Conduct for MPs that was drafted and recommended by the Integrity Commission and which was adopted by both houses in late 2018. The adopted Code of Conduct's preamble states, and I quote, "Members of Parliament recognise that their actions have an impact on the lives of all Tasmanian people. Fulfilling their obligations and discharging their duties responsibly requires a commitment to the highest ethical standards to maintain and strengthen the democratic traditions of the state and the integrity of its institutions. Compliance with the law may not always be enough to guarantee an acceptable standard of conduct. Members must not only act lawfully, but also in a manner that will withstand close public scrutiny. This code sets out ethical standards and principles to assist members in observing expected standards of conduct in public office and to act as a benchmark against which their conduct can be measured." The code goes on further, Madam Deputy President, and I won't read the full of it, but I will also make mention of the statement of values which sits with it, which details, and again I quote from that statement of values, "This code is derived from the fundamental values of the institution of the Parliament of this state. By adopting and upholding the code, all members of Parliament share and support these values. As members of Parliament, we value the public interest and the fundamental objective of public office to act solely in terms of the public interest, the improvement of the economic and social conditions of all Tasmanian people and our service to our fellow citizens to achieve this, the promotion of human, social and environmental welfare through the responsible execution of our official duties, integrity, honesty, accessibility, accountability, fairness and transparency, courtesy, respect and understanding without harassment, victimisation or discrimination. Further, respect for differences, equity and fairness in political dealings with fellow members of Parliament, and ethical political practices that support the democratic traditions of our state and its institutions and the rejection of political corruption." This code, then, But for the purposes of this debate, these statement of values, I think, and these statement of values are particularly important and useful to help us focus as we consider the motion before us, because it goes to the heart of what this motion is actually asking us to do as members of Parliament. Fundamentally, Madam Deputy President, this motion asks us as elected representatives to walk the talk of our code of conduct that we have all pledged to uphold in this place. It's asking us to put aside any personal discomfort we may feel about the outcome and findings of any such review, and any implications such findings may hold for our respective political allegiances. It asks us instead to place first and foremost our collective commitment to demonstrate, as per our code of conduct, the highest ethical standards to maintain and strengthen the democratic traditions of the state and the integrity of its institutions. And this motion is asking us to provide the Tasmanian community with an appropriate and accountable forum where they can raise their experiences and legitimate concerns pertaining to the May elections. Madam Deputy President, all of us here are well aware that a range of concerns and questions were raised in the lead-up and in the period following the 2021 state election and Legislative Council elections. These arose from across the Tasmanian community, from political experts and commentators, from former and current elected representatives, and from concerned voters. Other members here may well have received emails and other communications, as I did, from constituents and the Tasmanian community members and from Tasmanian community members around the state, raising concerns and asking questions. Indicative of those questions and concerns were the following. The legitimacy of the rationale provided for calling an early election for the House of Assembly. Potential voter disenfranchisement in the Windermere and Derwent elections, with the apparent failure to provide Legislative Council ballot papers at voting booths beyond the borders of Windermere and Derwent. Issues with the pre-selection and subsequent resignation of Adam Brooks in the electorate of Braddon. The impact of concurrent House of Assembly and Legislative Council elections for the first time in the history of this state, including clarity on how the financial benefit accrued from the lower house election campaigning activities will be assessed against the legislated restrictions applied to the Legislative Council elections. Madam Deputy President, when such a range of persistent and real concerns are raised, it is our duty to listen. When we hear such concerns voiced, it goes to the heart of the integrity of Tasmania's democracy and governance. It would be disrespectful and a grave disservice for us, those tasked with representing the community, to allow these questions and concerns to be dismissed, indeed swept under the carpet. Whether we agree with all, some or none of these matters raised is immaterial. The crucial matter is that, having resoundingly been put forward and heard, they need to be resolved. To be resolved, they need to be aired, identified for further examination and inquiry within an appropriate and robust forum. To fail to do this invites a further erosion of public confidence in the institutions of our democracy and in this place. Madam Deputy President, I will not be prosecuting arguments here today on the validity or otherwise of the concerns that I have mentioned as examples of those arising in relation to the 2021 elections. This debate on this motion is not the place for such an exercise. Rather, this debate is on the validity of providing a formal, appropriate and accountable process for those arguments to be prosecuted by any Tasmanian citizen who wishes to advance them. I will, however, speak briefly in this context about the issue of the concurrence of the General and Legislative Council elections. This is of particular relevance to this chamber, and I wish to note merely some matters on the public record. Premier Gutwein has the distinction of being the first Premier in Tasmania's history to set a state general election on the same day as a scheduled Legislative Council elections. This decision to hold concurrent elections for the first time in our state's history is, in and of itself, a compelling reason to establish the Joint Select Committee proposed in this motion to undertake an election inquiry and review to ascertain the ramifications and impact of this historic first. Any ramifications and impact deserve careful elucidation and consideration on the parliamentary record, including if it is ultimately deemed that there were none of consequence. It is important to understand and to learn from what transpired as a result of holding concurrent elections of both Houses of Parliament for the first time in our state. It is our job, the job of both Houses of Parliament, to do this. The possibility and perhaps the risk that there would be ramifications and impacts of concurrent elections was immediately identified by all independent members of this chamber and many members of the Tasmanian community. Further, it was identified by many holding these concerns that there were other options available to obviate the potential risks. Namely, the Legislative Council elections can be held on any Saturday in May without changes to legislation. I, along with 5 independent colleagues in this place, wrote to the Premier expressing our concerns that concurrent elections provided an advantage to party-aligned candidates in Legislative Council seats being contested. Our letter requested that the Premier advise the Governor to shift the Upper House election by 2 weeks to a weekend later in May, which would comply with both the Constitution Act and the Electoral Act. I will read the letter that we wrote to the Premier on this matter into the parliamentary record. Dear Premier, re-Legislative Council election date. As independent members of the Legislative Council, we write to express our significant concern at your decision to set the House of Assembly election on the same date as the scheduled 2021 Legislative Council elections. Your decision to align Legislative Council and House of Assembly election dates for the first time in the history of the Tasmanian Parliament risks undermining the important and separate role of the Legislative Council in holding the government of the day to account. It is key to a healthy democracy. Even had there been an imperative to set the date of 1st of May of this House of Assembly election, a further option would have been to delay the 2021 Legislative Council elections to a later date in May, for which there is provision in both the Constitution Act 1934 and the Electoral Act 2004. This option remains available. Therefore, with regard to the 2021 Legislative Council elections, our preference would be that the date for this election be immediately rescheduled for a later date in May to avoid the conflict of dates. Regardless, we seek a firm commitment from you that should the Liberal Party be returned to government in this state election, you progress and or support legislative reform to ensure that in future such an alignment of election dates is not permitted, as is the case with a conflict with the date of a federal government election. The alignment of elections provides an undoubted advantage to party-affiliated candidates over independent candidates running in the Legislative Council elections. This is clearly in opposition to the Legislative Council electoral system, which, as designed, provides an even playing field to all candidates through measures such as a separate election cycle, election spending caps, and the disallowance of electoral spending from political parties or third parties. Party-aligned Legislative Council candidates will significantly benefit from activities related to the concurrent House of Assembly election, including whole-of-party election advertising, high visibility of party branding for House of Assembly election candidates, access to stakeholder functions, group media opportunities and public events organised and possibly funded by House of Assembly candidates, parties or third parties. It is unclear how financial benefit from these kinds of activities will be assessed against the legislated restrictions applied to Legislative Council elections. Legislative Council elections occur on a separate and distinct electoral cycle. This provides the opportunity for Tasmanian voters to more fully appreciate and respect the differing roles of both Houses of Parliament. House of Assembly elections are contested on a policy basis to form the government of the day. Legislative Council elections are contested to select members for the House of Review, whose primary function is to hold the government of the day to account. In a shared effort to ensure a strong, healthy Tasmanian democracy and appropriately functioning Parliament for the people of Tasmania, for the Tasmanian people, we ask that you give this matter full and fair consideration and provide a prompt response to the undersigned. And it is signed by the Honourable Ivan Dean, the Honourable Tanya Rattray, the Honourable Ruth Forrest, the Honourable Rosemary Armitage, the Honourable Rob Valentine and the Honourable Meg Webb. That letter was sent on the 31st of March 2021. I seek leave, Madam Deputy President, to table that letter here now.
The honourable member seeks leave. Is leave granted? Those that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Against no? I think the ayes have it.
Madam Deputy President, the Premier declined the request in that letter to delay the Legislative Council elections to a weekend later in May, and this was his response, received on the 1st of April 2021. Dear members, thank you for your letter of 31st March 2021, raising concerns regarding the timing of the general election for the House of Assembly, which has been called for 1st of May 2021. The question of whether there is any legal impediment to calling the general election on the same day as the Legislative Council election was considered before the election was called. The power to call an election is an executive power exercised in accordance with the Electoral Act, and I'm advised there is no legal or constitutional matter that would prevent both elections from taking place on the same day. Additionally, the Executive Government is held to account by the opposition in Parliament and is ultimately accountable to the Tasmanian community at an election. Accordingly, I do not agree with your position that it is the Legislative Council that exercises the primary function of holding the government of the day to account. Even if such an argument is made, I do not agree that holding both elections on Saturday, 1st of May, in any way blurs the lines of the independent functions of the two houses. For these reasons, I will not be seeking for the date of either the general election of the House of Assembly nor the Legislative Council elections to be changed. Yours sincerely, Peter Gutwein, MP Premier. Madam Deputy President, I seek leave to table that response.
The member seeks leave. Is leave granted? Those that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Against no? I think the ayes have it.
Madam Deputy President, I won't presume to speak for any of my colleagues, but for myself, it would be a significant understatement to say that I find this response from the Premier disappointing. In fact, I find it disrespectful and ill-informed. As much as any Premier or government of the day may wish it, political convenience and bald-faced assertions do not define or shape the fundamental roles and principles of our Parliament, the institution which sits at the centre of our democracy. The Legislative Council is a house of review, it is a house of legislation, and it has a key role in holding the government of the day to account. This role of the Tasmanian Legislative Council is outlined on page 3 of the Legislative Council Annual Report 2019-2020 and is described as follows. The Legislative Council, as the upper house of the Parliament of Tasmania, can be described as democratic with an independent character. The role of the Council is threefold. 1, to authorise the raising of revenue and the expenditure of state monies. 2, to examine the merits of legislation. And 3, to provide a parliamentary check on the government of the day. In modern times, the role of the Legislative Council has expanded from the base of being a purely legislative body to a house that involves itself in the examination and analysis of actions, decisions and workings of executive government." End of quote. When I consider this reply that we received from the Premier, I also hark back to the Code of Conduct and in particular these points from it. Fulfilling their obligations and discharging their duties responsibly requires a commitment to the highest ethical standards to maintain and strengthen the democratic traditions of the state and the integrity of its institutions. Compliance with the law may not always be enough to guarantee an acceptable standard of conduct. Members must not only act lawfully but also in a manner that will withstand close public scrutiny. Our statement of values is something that also comes to mind, where it says, as members, we value respect for differences, equity and fairness in political dealings with fellow members of Parliament, and ethical political practices that support the democratic traditions of our state and its institutions and the rejection of political corruption. To reiterate, for the health of our democracy, the matters relating to concurrent elections and those other concerns and questions that have arisen also remain unaddressed despite the Premier's assertions otherwise and need to be resolved. They need to be aired, identified for further examination and inquiry within an appropriate and robust forum. Which begs the question, Madam Deputy President, where and how might this occur? Whose jurisdiction is it? Madam Deputy President, first of all, the Integrity Commission was thought by some to be an appropriate forum for examining some matters raised in relation to the elections. However, we now know that the Tasmanian Integrity Commission has ruled itself out as a viable option in light of a particular election-related referral that was submitted to it. Its advice, reported recently in the media, apparently was that this referral was outside the Commission's jurisdiction, and I quote, because misconduct allegations against Mr Gutwin fell within the election period. The Commission's Chief Executive Officer was then quoted by the ABC on the 11th of June this year as saying, and I quote, "The impact of the Parliament's dissolution is that sitting members no longer hold their seats in Parliament. They cease to be MPs and are no longer public officers. We acknowledge that government ministers retain their ministerial role during the election period and remain subject to the Ministerial Code of Conduct. However, given we only have jurisdiction over ministers due to their status as MPs, I can confirm that we do not have jurisdiction over ministers, including the Premier, during the election period." Madam Deputy President, I am sure this was a very interesting and most disturbing revelation to many Tasmanians, that we apparently have ministers who are not members of Parliament, contrary to the fundamental principles of a Westminster Parliament, and yet, even within that select group of which the Premier, as Minister of the Crown, belongs, apparently the Integrity Commission still lack jurisdiction. And I just wish to pause here briefly to point out that if the Integrity Commission's advice is the case, and at this stage we have no reason nor means to counter it, those non-MP ministers and their freewheeling caretaker government arrangements are in an incredibly powerful position for that period of time. No pesky Parliament to hold them to account, and also we now learn, apparently, beyond the jurisdiction of the state's integrity watchdog during election periods on the basis that Parliament is dissolved. Charles I would be cheering to hear about this arrangement. But in all seriousness, Madam Deputy President, this situation of non-parliamentary accountable ministers, even for a relatively brief period of time, highlights just how important caretaker conventions are. And yet, that is one area where serious concerns have also been raised in light of the May elections, certainly to me directly and perhaps to others here. Madam Deputy President, this whole bizarre situation of when is a minister not an MP and subsequent implications for independent oversight, parliamentary accountability and caretaker conventions is another matter that would be sufficient in and of itself to warrant the proposed parliamentary election inquiry that this motion puts forward. So, with the Integrity Commission having ruled itself out of contention, we move on. Some may have wondered at the suitability of the Office of the Ombudsman to undertake some form of review of some aspects of the 2021 election. However, although the Tasmanian Ombudsman is recognised as an integrity entity, it is perceived and accepted, I think, by most that the scope of this proposed election review is beyond that office's remit also. Perhaps then it may be the role of the Tasmanian Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission is a statutory, independent and impartial body. It is responsible for the conduct not only of the elections of both houses of this Parliament, but also local council elections, other statutory elections and the implementation of electoral boundary redistributions. It's actually quite standard for the TEC to be a participant in inquiries by making formal representations to relevant parliamentary reviews. For example, Under the previous Liberal government's 2018 review into the Tasmanian Electoral Act 2004, the TEC made a submission to that process both in 2018 and again in response to that review's interim report in 2019. It is not the TEC's role, nor would it be possible for it to undertake an inquiry into the full range of matters that have arisen as questions and concerns relating to the 2021 elections. For example, it would not be within the TEC's role to fully examine the political decisions surrounding the circumstances of the elections, such as the choice to hold concurrent elections. Further, when it comes to other matters such as concerns about a lack of access to upper house election ballot papers, then we would be put at risk of placing the TEC in the untenable position of investigating itself. Madam Deputy President, although all of these entities, particularly the TEC, would provide very useful information and insight into any inquiry, it is beyond their jurisdiction to conduct the proposed election review inquiry themselves. There does not exist an appropriate non-parliamentary mechanism or forum by which to undertake the necessary, rigorous and public examination of legitimate matters pertaining to the May 2021 elections. Therefore, the responsibility comes back to this parliament. Hence, I had a quick look to see whether other parliaments have established appropriate mechanisms by which to fulfil this very responsibility. And let me share with you what I found. Madam Deputy President, the Federal Parliament has a joint standing committee on electoral matters. Its primary role is to conduct, I quote, inquiries into such matters relating to electoral laws and practices and their administration as may be referred to it by either House of Parliament or a minister. And this includes a standing review of each federal election during years federal elections are held. When each federal election is reviewed by this joint standing committee, for that inquiry, the committee consists of 10 members, comprised from both the House of Representatives and the Senate. It includes government and opposition members, minority party members, independent members. This federal standing committee has reported on a range of interesting matters pertaining to the conduct of our national elections and broader related matters, including one that concluded just last month on the future conduct of election operations during times of emergency situations. In May 2020, this committee reported on the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment lowering the donation disclosure threshold Bill 2019, a very interesting topic that we would find interesting in this jurisdiction too, no doubt. But significantly, the committee's most recent election review, its report on the conduct of the 2019 federal election and matters related thereto, tabled in December 2020, provides specific matters pertaining to this debate we have today. That report's foreword, written by the committee chair, Liberal Senator the Honourable James McGrath, states, and I quote, "Australia is lucky. We are blessed that we live in one of the oldest and most successful democracies in the world. Our good fortune has come not through chance. Our democracy works because over a century, a lot of people, paid and unpaid, have worked to make it so through blood, sweat and tears. Our democracy works because countless Australians have made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the freedoms inherent in democracy. As society has changed, so should our electoral system be fine-tuned. Now is the time for immediate action by Parliament to certain changes and for a longer conversation about other reforms." Madam Deputy President, this most recent federal election report, members here may be very proud, and in fact should be very proud, to learn that this most recent report recommended to increase fairness and to reduce the luck of the ballot draw while minimising the so-called donkey vote. The Robson rotation of candidates on the ballot paper should be introduced for the House of Representatives in tandem. There you go, Madam Deputy President. A Tasmanian initiative we've utilised for decades is now being advocated via that regular and routine election review process for introduction into the federal electoral system for the express purpose of increasing fairness. That must be the fine-tuning referred to by the chair of that committee in his foreword. The review report of the 2019 federal election contains 27 recommendations, in fact, which I will not detail now, but suffice to say they span a range of election-related matters, which some of us here may or may not agree with, including reforms to the Electoral Act, operations of the AEC, tackling issues with donor transparency and implications of electoral roll maintenance for local government, to mention just a few of the areas covered. But they are all based upon reviewing what did or did not work with the operations of the 2019 federal election, matters arising from new specific considerations generated by that election, as well as long-standing and more long-term proposed areas for change. It may also be interesting to note that the Tasmanian federal members who participated in the 2019 federal election standard routine review were Senator Carol Brown as Committee Deputy Chair, Senator the Honourable Erica Betts, Senator Katrina Billick, Senator Helen Polley and Senator Anne Urquhart. Madam Deputy President, I must confess that after going back through this Standing Committee's reports on the last 8 federal elections, which takes us back to 1998, when John Howard was elected Prime Minister, I stopped counting. However, it is interesting that in the period spanning those 8 elections, there were both federal Labor and coalition winners of government involved. Neither attempted to hinder this Standing Committee from fulfilling its election review role, and instead, as with the 2019 latest example I've summarised above or previously, they have actively participated in the process. That's a very interesting precedent for us to consider in relation to this motion that we have currently before us. Surely, if federal elected Labor and Liberal representatives can participate in such an election review process nationally, it can't be in a position to do so here in Tasmania. Madam Deputy President, at the state level, there are also current examples of similar standing parliamentary committees dedicated to electoral matters. The New South Wales Parliament has its dedicated Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. That committee's remit is as follows. The committee inquire into and report upon such matters as may be referred to it by either House of Parliament or a minister that relate to 2A, the following electoral laws: 1, Electoral Act 2017, other than Part 3, 2, Electoral Funding Act 2018, and 3, those provisions of the Constitution Act 1902 that relate to the procedures for and conduct of elections for members of the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council, other than sections 27, 28 and 28A. B, the administration of and practices associated with the electoral laws described at A. 3, all matters that relate to 2A and B above in respect to the 23 March 2019 state elections shall stand referred to the committee for any inquiry the committee may wish to make. The committee shall report on the outcome of any such inquiry within 18 months of the date of this resolution being agreed by both houses. So again, similar to the Federal Standing Committee, New South Wales has a dedicated parliamentary committee for the examination of all electoral law related matters, plus a review of their state elections as a matter of routine. Its current 10 members consist of 4 Liberal MPs, 3 ALP MPs, 2 National MPs and 1 Shooters, Fishers and Farmers MP. The latest report of this New South Wales committee was the administration of the 2019 New South Wales State Election Report, tabled in October last year. Its recommendations range from electoral expenditure and caps, funding the New South Wales Electoral Commission, early voting options, nominations processes, accessible voting, compliance and enforcement resourcing, amongst other matters, some general as well as some specifically raised in the context of that state's 2019 state election. In his foreword to this report, Committee Chair, Liberal MP Mr Lee Evans states, and I quote, "Administering the free and fair elections that the people of New South Wales rightly expect in a democracy such as ours is a major undertaking, and I would like to commend the New South Wales Electoral Commissioner, Mr John Schmidt, and his staff for their professionalism in delivering the election in March 2019. Mr Evans further continues, The inquiry has been a valuable opportunity for the committee to hear from a range of stakeholders about the conduct of the 2019 New South Wales state election and to reflect on what worked well and where improvements could be made for future elections. The committee's recommendations are wide-ranging, covering election timeframes and the campaign period, the electoral roll and the ballot paper, early voting, election day and compliance with and enforcement of the electoral legislation. Madam Deputy President, those sentiments fit exactly within the text and intent of the motion in my name currently before this House that we debate. It is also worth noting that clearly the New South Wales Parliament does not consider that the existence of a New South Wales Electoral Commission somehow negates its own oversight responsibility. Instead, they serve different functions and work in a complementary manner to benefit the people of New South Wales. Lastly, I'll move on to our neighbours in Victoria, whose Standing Electoral Matters Committee is a joint investigatory committee of that Parliament. Its remit is the committee's functions are to inquire into, consider and report to the Parliament on any proposals, matter or thing concerned with A, the conduct of parliamentary elections and referendums in Victoria, B, the conduct of elections of councillors under the Local Government Act 2020, C, the administration of or practices associated with the Electoral Act 2002 and any other law relating to electoral matters. The committee's functions are not intended to repeal, alter or vary Section 94F or 94G of the Constitution Act 1975. The current membership of this Victorian Standing Committee is 10 MPs, and that consists of 4 Labor, 3 Liberal, 1 Animal Justice Party, 1 Victorian Greens and 1 Liberal Democrat. This Victorian Joint Standing Committee has held inquiries into issues as diverse as voter participation and informal voting, political donations, electronic voting, civics and electoral participation in Victorian state parliamentary elections, social media impacts on elections, as well as the routine review of the 2006, 2010, 2014 and the most recent 2018 state elections. The Chair's foreword from the Labor MP Mr Lee Talamas opens with this. The Electoral Matters Committee plays an important role in keeping our democracy strong. This includes conducting inquiries like this one after each state election. These inquiries provide an opportunity for any member of the community, any candidate and any other stakeholder to share their experiences and to suggest improvements to the system. The inquiries provide an opportunity for scrutiny of the Victorian Electoral Commission and for regularly reviewing the appropriateness of the electoral law. Madam Deputy President, these sentiments could and I believe should preface an equivalent Tasmanian parliamentary report detailing the findings of a similar opportunity provided to any member of the Tasmanian community following each of our state elections. To wrap up this brief overview of the interstate examples, it's clear other jurisdictions consider it appropriate and in fact necessary to place the responsibility upon elected members of Parliament to undertake this public and transparent mode of election review. It's also worth noting that these routine election reviews may or may not identify specific issues or problems with any particular poll, but they also canvass, consult and make constructive recommendations intended to improve their respective democratic institutions. I mentioned the Federal Committee's recommendation to adopt the Robson rotation, for example. Similarly, such positive work should also be undertaken by this motion's proposed committee. It may have cause to look into the matter that I noted the member for McIntyre made during her Governor's in reply speech just last week, that maybe it's time Tasmania explores the option of fixed-term elections. Any of these matters may be considered under this sort of inquiry. Further, those parliaments that I've just discussed see MPs of all political persuasions and affiliations participate in their respective parliamentary electoral review inquiries as a matter of course, and apparently without feeling threatened in any manner. These routine parliamentary reviews are accepted as exactly that, routine maintenance and investment in the important and vital aspect of our democracy, which is our free and fair elections. Madam Deputy President, it is also worth noting in relation to some suggestions that the TEC is already the entity undertaking our election process's health check. All these jurisdictions which have parliamentary standing committees reviewing their elections also have their equivalent to the TEC. Federally, the AEC undertakes a similar role to the TEC in administering elections, as does the New South Wales Electoral Commission and the Victorian Electoral Commission. In those jurisdictions, it's not perceived as a case of either or. Instead, there is a clear recognition of the different roles and functions required and provided by both. In fact, as clearly articulated in the Victorian Committee report I referred to, these inquiries provide an avenue for those electoral commissions to also be scrutinised, as well as provide their own feedback. This brings me to touch briefly on an accusation that I have found levelled against me in proposing this committee of inquiry, and that is that the call is somehow motivated by sour grapes. Unsurprisingly, we have already heard that calls for a rigorous, public and transparent review of the unprecedented conjunct May elections is somehow just a bad case of sour grapes, or actually in one media report it was described as the pursuit of personal bugbears. Not only is that attempt to diminish and dismiss this serious responsibility, this serious proposal, sadly predictable, it's also very telling those seeking to mischaracterise the intent and the motivation behind this proposal. In fact, I want to flip that spurious assertion that this is somehow sour grapes to call for Tasmanians to have the same democracy oversight mechanisms as they are afforded at the federal level, and just as their fellow citizens receive in New South Wales and Victoria. In actual fact, Madam Deputy President, it is very much sour grapes for the victors of any election to deny such oversight. Indeed, it could be regarded as well beyond sour grapes and perhaps veering into an inappropriate or, at best, ungracious misuse of power. Indeed, it should be unremarkable for electoral winners to have the courage of their convictions to stand up and say, I am prepared to participate with good faith in the health check of this system, to check it is still delivering best practice on behalf of voters as well as potential future candidates. If there are areas that can be strengthened and improved, then I want to be part of that. Madam Deputy President, that is all this motion is requesting indeed, that in the absence of any viable and appropriate alternative, we in good faith allow and participate in a public, transparent health check of the system that placed all of us here. Each and every one of us in this chamber are successful candidates, privileged to be elected on behalf of our respective electorates and act in the interests of those electorates. As successful contestants of our own parliamentary elections, we need to now face up and front up to our responsibility as parliamentarians, to graciously and courageously put first and act in the interests of the parliamentary democracy, of which we are but temporary custodians on behalf of all Tasmanians. To suggest that we do so could not be further removed from spurious sour grapes motivations, and it should be beneath anyone privileged to be an elected representative here to allow it to be mischaracterised as such. Madam Deputy President, this motion does not present a radical or subversive idea. As we can see in the routine and established practices of some of our interstate counterparts, proud Conservatives, including governments led by Prime Minister John Howard through to current Prime Minister Scott Morrison, have all voted during each commencement stage of their respective parliaments to reconvene their standing committees with the responsibility of reviewing the election just held, which delivered their victory, just as newly elected Labor, federal and interstate governments have done at a state level. And then they have participated, along with their political opponents, in those election reviews. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, if not here, where? If not us, who? The recent ABC 2021 Australia Talks survey asked respondents to indicate their level of agreement with the statement, "Politicians in Australia can generally be trusted to act in the interests of the people they represent." I was deeply dismayed to see that amongst our fellow Tasmanians, 76% disagreed with that statement. 3 in 4 Tasmanians disagree that we here, each of us, can be trusted to act in the interests of those we represent. Even more heartbreaking than this figure is that this figure has worsened substantially from only 2 years ago in 2019 when it stood at 64%. This distressing public perception is entirely on us. It is our and only our responsibility to turn this around, and clearly business as usual is driving it in the wrong direction. Madam Deputy President, in the 1 week since the opening of this 50th Tasmanian Parliament, 1 week ago today in fact, it is interesting to note that the government in this week has issued at least 4 separate media statements regarding sport and the AFL. Now, I am in no way disparaging football. I recognise its significant role it plays and the joy it brings to many in the community. However, the point I would make is this. Can you imagine if our government went into bat for the health and integrity of our democracy as it goes into bat for a Tasmanian football team? Imagine if the government was as ferocious in its defence of Tasmania's right to a modern, robust and rigorously transparent and accountable parliamentary democracy as it is in defending the state's right to its own football team. Imagine if our Premier threw down challenges to other states to try to best us, not in goal kicks, but in levels of public confidence. Just imagine that. I doubt we would need to be holding this debate today on this motion if that scenario was real instead of imaginary. But I believe it's possible for us to achieve it. I believe in us here in this place. And it is with that hope of the possible that I bring this proposal to the Parliament for consideration. Hope that all of us here, who with great solemnity pledged to uphold those principles outlined in our Code of Conduct, will see this not as a challenge, but as an opportunity to act upon the pledges of responsibility to the Tasmanian people beyond any other affiliations. This motion asks us to put partisan tribalism aside and instead don the one set of colours that is Tasmania's democracy. To put first what is best for the Tasmanian people over what may be best for ourselves or our political parties. It is with that hope that we can come together to collaborate for this greater good, Madam Deputy President. On that, I commend this motion to the House.
The question is the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. I'll move for Hobart.